A millionaire focused on his next big deal was just moments away from boarding his private jet when three little girls stopped him with a single word that froze his heart. What could possibly make a man give up everything right there on the runway? This is a story about unexpected encounters, second chances, and the kind of moment that changes everything. Daniel Hartman's life operated like a Swiss watch. Each tick accounted for, every gear polished with intention. That morning, as he walked briskly through the private terminal of the Atlanta airport, he wasn't thinking of anything beyond the Zurich meeting that awaited him. A tech magnate with a reputation for cold efficiency, Daniel thrived in a world of certainty and numbers. His phone was pressed to his ear, his assistant rattling off last-minute details about the European Investor Conference. He wasn't really listening anymore. His mind was already on the revised pitch deck he'd fine-tuned during the flight. As he approached the sleek steps of his private jet, the crew gave him polite nods, recognizing the rhythm of a man always moving forward. He placed one foot on the first step when something unexpected happened, something that didn't fit into any calendar block or itinerary. He turned sharply, not expecting to see anything out of the ordinary, perhaps a staff member with a forgotten document, or an airport official about to announce a delay. But instead, his eyes met three tiny faces. Three little girls, nearly identical in appearance, barely tall enough to reach his waist, stood shoulder to shoulder on the tarmac. They looked no older than 5, their pale blonde hair hanging in soft waves over the collars of their simple red dresses. Their sneakers were worn and mismatched, their hands tightly clasped together, forming a solid line of unity. What startled Daniel the most wasn't just their sudden appearance, but the emotion in their eyes, an intensity, a desperation, that didn't belong on children's faces. One of them, the smallest, stepped forward, eyes wide and unblinking. Her lips parted, and in a trembling voice she said a single word: "Help." He didn't stop for strangers, much less children, but something in the way she said it, so soft yet urgent, broke through the years of practiced detachment. He stepped down from the stairs instinctively, phone forgotten in his hand, suitcase abandoned near the steps. The jet engines hummed in the distance, but for the first time in years Daniel didn't hear them. He crouched down, suddenly aware of how alien he must look in his tailored suit. "Where are your parents?" he asked carefully, trying to make his voice sound gentler than he felt. The girls looked at each other, exchanged a silent nod, and then answered together in eerie synchronization, "We don't know." They were pale, visibly shaken, their eyes scanning his face for clues, for trust. Daniel straightened slowly, glancing around, expecting someone, anyone, to come running toward them, calling their names, apologizing for the confusion, but no one came. The tarmac stretched out behind them, silent and empty. He looked back at the girls. Their dresses, though identical, bore subtle stains and wrinkles. The smallest one clutched the hem of hers tightly, as if it grounded her. Another had a faint scratch above her eyebrow. They weren't just alone. They had been alone for some time. Daniel's heart, which had rarely felt more than the tight constriction of business anxiety, gave a strange and unfamiliar ache. These girls had come to him, specifically him, with no context, no reason. They had chosen his presence over all others. It made no sense, and yet it felt impossibly significant. But not this time. He didn't move. He looked down again at the girls, their tiny bodies tense, their eyes too old for their faces. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and without breaking eye contact, canceled the flight with a few quick taps. The action felt surreal. He'd never missed a meeting, never changed a plan this abruptly. Yet here he was, grounding himself, literally, because 3 unknown children had whispered for help. He extended his hand. "Come with me," he said gently. No hesitation. One by one, they each placed their hand in his. Small, cold fingers wrapped around his. They followed him off the tarmac and back into the terminal, away from the jet, away from Zurich, away from the future he'd always been convinced was the only one worth chasing. They sat closely together, never letting go of each other, knees touching, hands still clasped. They didn't cry. They didn't fidget. They simply waited, watched him. And Daniel, for the first time in as long as he could remember, didn't feel like a man in control. He crouched again to their level, this time not to question but to observe. Each girl had something unique despite their matching features. One had a softer gaze, another a nervous twitch in her fingers. The third never broke eye contact, her stare unwavering. He didn't know what to ask next. There were no scripts for this moment, no protocol. The only thing he knew for sure was this: these girls needed something, and for reasons he couldn't explain, they had chosen him. He didn't know why, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He had stopped. For the first time in his career, his schedule meant nothing. Daniel Hartman, the man who never made time for anyone, had made a choice. And as the girls leaned against him, warm and real, he knew it was the right one. Daniel sat across from the three girls in the quiet section of the terminal, his elbows resting on his knees, phone forgotten in his coat pocket. He watched them closely, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Their identical faces offered little guidance. Each pair of pale blue eyes mirrored the same wary calm. They had followed him without protest, trusted him without question, and now they sat there, as if waiting for him to figure out what to do next. He leaned in slightly, not wanting to scare them, and asked again, "Do you know where your mom went?" One of the girls, the same one who had first spoken to him on the tarmac, answered quietly, "She fell down at the airport. People came and took her in the loud car." Another added, "They said we couldn't go with her." The third girl's lips trembled, but she didn't cry. "We didn't want to stay with the people in uniforms," she whispered. Daniel felt a slow burn of discomfort rise inside him. Not because they had run from airport security, but because it was beginning to dawn on him that these kids had been alone, scared, and overlooked. They hadn't wandered onto the wrong flight. They had come to him specifically, out of fear and instinct. He repeated their story in his mind, each piece fitting together in a way that left him unsettled. Their mother collapsed at the airport. An ambulance arrived. The girls, told to wait with strangers, refused. Somehow they escaped, wandered through restricted areas, and ended up on the tarmac. It was all so improbable that it bordered on surreal. Yet there they were, sitting across from him, solid and quiet, trusting him more than they trusted any official in uniform. "What's your mom's name?" he asked carefully. For the first time, all three looked at each other before answering. Then, in perfect synchrony, as if rehearsed, one said, "Clara Jensen." The name didn't just sound familiar. It detonated in his brain like a memory he had spent years trying to suppress. Clara, the woman he had once thought he would marry. The one he had left behind for the gleaming promises of venture capital and Silicon Valley boardrooms. He hadn't heard her name spoken aloud in over 6 years, hadn't seen her face outside the private corners of his guilt. His throat went dry. Jensen. The last name hadn't changed. She hadn't married, or at least not publicly. Daniel blinked, trying to make sense of the rush of information now surging through his chest. Clara Jensen, here, in Atlanta, and apparently, the mother of 3 girls who could very well be his. He sat back, the full weight of the moment crashing into him. He hadn't thought about Clara in years, or at least that's what he told himself. But if he was being honest, she'd never really left his mind. She had been the one person who saw past his ambition, who loved him when he had nothing but big dreams and cheap suits, and he had walked away from her, not with anger, not with cruelty, just with silence. He had chosen his future over their shared present and never looked back. Now, sitting across from these 3 near-identical girls with eyes too familiar to ignore, he wondered what that silence had cost him. "Do you know how long your mom has been in the hospital?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer didn't matter. "Not long," one of the girls said. "Maybe an hour," another added. "The man said she might wake up later." Their sentences were clipped, cautious, like they'd learned quickly how to talk in uncertain rooms. Daniel felt something twist inside his chest. Had Clara raised them alone? Did they have anyone else? And the question he wasn't ready to ask, but couldn't stop circling, was slowly forming into something louder. Were they his daughters? He needed to confirm everything, and fast. He called his assistant with clipped instructions, voice steady even as his heart sprinted. "Check local ERs. Look for Clara Jensen. Tell me where she is." As the call ended, he looked back at the girls. They were watching him now, not afraid, not demanding, just waiting. He wondered what Clara had told them, if anything, about him. Did they know who he was? Or had fate just dumped them at his feet without even that thin thread of recognition? The idea that Clara could have raised 3 children without telling him filled him with a confusing mix of betrayal and guilt. But also, clarity. He had chosen to leave, and if she'd been left to raise them without him, perhaps that decision hadn't been hers. Perhaps she had protected them from a man who hadn't been ready to stay. He swallowed hard, pushing down the regrets already rising in his throat. He wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was certain. His world had shifted the moment that name left their lips. He bought them bottles of water, watched them sip slowly, politely, like they knew how to behave around strangers. One of them clutched a vending machine snack in both hands but didn't eat it. They were waiting for something. For him. And the more he watched them, the more pieces of Clara he began to see. The way the middle one tilted her head when thinking. The way the smallest crossed her ankles when sitting. These weren't coincidences. These were echoes. Silent reminders of a past he'd buried under acquisitions and startup launches. Finally, his phone buzzed. The message was short but enough. Clara Jensen, Midtown General, critical care, no emergency contact listed. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then looked back at the girls. "Your mom is at the hospital," he said quietly. "I'm going to take you there. I'll make sure you're safe." They didn't ask how he knew or question why he was helping. One by one, they stood and followed him again, just as they had the first time. His car was parked nearby, and as they climbed inside, he realized that the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of possibility, of unknown truths, and of one terrifying thought he could no longer ignore. If Clara Jensen had kept her daughters a secret all this time, it was very likely that they were his. The girls explained that their mother, Clara Jensen, had collapsed and was taken away in an ambulance. Frightened, they ran from airport security and somehow ended up near Daniel's jet. Clara had been the love of his youth, the woman he walked away from to chase his career. He had no idea she still lived in the city, and more shockingly, he had no idea she had children. As Daniel pulled his car out of the airport's private lot and merged onto the main road toward Midtown General Hospital, his thoughts were in turmoil. The girls sat in the back seat, unusually quiet, huddled close together like magnets. He caught glimpses of them in the rearview mirror. One leaned her head against another's shoulder. The smallest traced invisible shapes on the window with her fingertip. There was something deeply synchronized about the way they moved and breathed, like they were parts of a single being, bonded far beyond simple sisterhood. That intimacy was undeniable. But what shook Daniel most wasn't just their closeness. It was the creeping thought growing louder with every glance. What if they're mine? He hadn't seen Clara in over 6 years. It lined up. The age, the eyes, the slight downturn of the mouth when they were serious. It all pointed in one direction. He gripped the wheel tighter. Clara had never told him. She had never reached out. And now she lay unconscious in a hospital bed while 3 girls with her face, and possibly his, sat quietly in his back seat, trusting him with something neither of them had ever discussed: fatherhood. The hospital was bustling when they arrived, but Daniel didn't waste time. He informed the nurse at reception about Clara and mentioned the girls by name. The woman's demeanor shifted quickly from professional distance to quiet empathy. She led them to a family lounge just down the hall from the critical care unit. A social worker was called to take basic details, and Daniel answered what he could, which wasn't much. The girls had already said more to him than anyone else. Once they were settled on the couch, he stepped into a nearby gift shop and bought simple essentials: a few snacks, 3 bottles of water, travel-sized toothbrushes, and a plush blanket. Then he returned to find them exactly as he left them, still, watchful, patient. Over the next few hours, something subtle changed. When they needed to use the bathroom, they looked to him. When someone in a white coat walked by too fast, they instinctively pressed closer to his side. By evening, they started calling him Mr. Daniel, not just in formality but with affection. It came naturally, without rehearsal, and it landed on his heart with a kind of soft finality. These girls, Leah, Nina, and Zoe, weren't just a part of Clara's life. They were beginning to shape his. As hours turned into days, Daniel remained at the hospital. He didn't leave, not even once. He arranged for clothes to be delivered for the girls, comfortable pajamas and a small suitcase of daywear. He ordered meals that catered to their quiet preferences. Plain noodles for Nina, buttered toast for Leah, and anything sweet for Zoe. He helped them brush their teeth at night in the hospital's family restroom, tucked them in on the long couch, and told them a story he barely remembered from his own childhood just to help them sleep. And when they had nightmares, which they often did, he was there without hesitation. He held Zoe's hand when she cried silently, placed a blanket back over Leah when she kicked it off, and let Nina fall asleep curled up at his side. In return, they began to open up. Leah asked him questions about his watch and how phones worked. Nina shyly asked if his house had a bathtub. Zoe brought him her scribbles on hospital paper, mostly suns, stick figures, and sometimes a man with messy hair surrounded by 3 small girls. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't need to. More than once, Daniel caught himself staring at them, not out of confusion anymore, but from something deeper and harder to name. In Leah, he saw Clara's steady resolve. In Nina, Clara's cautiousness, the way she used to hesitate before saying something important. And Zoe had the same boundless imagination Clara once brought into their conversations when she still believed in their future. It hurt, but it also gave him clarity. These girls weren't just familiar. They were echoes of a life he had turned his back on, one that had grown without him but hadn't shut him out completely. Daniel began documenting everything. He took notes on their routines, their preferences, and even their fears, in case a caseworker eventually questioned his right to stay involved. But in those quiet hospital days, it wasn't about paperwork or legalities. It was about showing up. Every hour he spent with them chipped away at the life he had built on solitude and ambition. He no longer checked his phone obsessively. Missed calls went unanswered. He wasn't thinking about Zurich or board meetings. He was thinking about Leah's protective instincts, Nina's whispered worries, and Zoe's bright eyes when she made him a drawing. He was thinking like someone who had something to lose. They asked him for updates before they looked at charts. He was the one they called when one of the girls got restless. He was the one they handed their snack trays to, trusting him to know who liked what. And he did. He had memorized it all. What shocked him most was how natural it felt. Not easy. Nothing about this was easy, but familiar in a way he didn't expect. There were moments he'd catch Zoe humming while coloring, or Nina braiding Leah's hair without being asked, and he would feel something shift inside him, something warm and terrifying. He wasn't ready to call himself their father, not without knowing for sure, but the line between stranger and parent was beginning to blur. Every time one of them reached for his hand or leaned into his side, it drew that line thinner. He had never felt more exposed. He had also never felt more certain that this, whatever this was, mattered more than anything else he had built alone. Daniel with affection. He got to know them. Leah, the protective one, Nina, the quiet observer, and Zoe, the dreamer who always drew families with 4 figures instead of 3. Clara's eyes opened slowly in the dim light of the hospital room, her gaze unfocused at first, her breath shallow. The movement was barely perceptible, just a twitch of her fingers, a blink longer than before, but Daniel noticed it immediately. He leaned forward from his chair beside the bed, heart pounding, unsure if it was real or just something he wanted to believe. Then her eyes opened again, more clearly this time, and she looked at him. Truly looked at him. It took her a moment to register what she was seeing, and even longer to find her voice. But when she did, it came out cracked and filled with disbelief. Daniel. The name left her mouth like a ghost she hadn't expected to confront again. Before he could respond, the girls stirred. Leah was the first to sit up from her curled position on the couch. Nina blinked, rubbed her eyes. Zoe, still holding the drawing she'd fallen asleep with, rushed to the bed and stood on her toes to look at her mother's face. Clara's expression crumpled. Her eyes filled with tears as she took in the sight of all 3 daughters by her side, and Daniel standing protectively among them. She reached weakly for Zoe's hand and then looked to Daniel, her lips trembling. "You found them," she whispered. He nodded, his throat tight. "They found me." It took her a moment longer to realize what that meant, that he had stayed, that he hadn't run. She closed her eyes briefly as if to steady herself, and when she opened them again, the truth came out in a broken whisper. "I never told you about them, because you left." She didn't say it in anger, but with the weight of someone who had held that silence for years. You walked away, Daniel. You made it clear that you were choosing your life, your future. I didn't want to chase you down and hand you a responsibility you didn't choose for yourself. Her voice faltered, but she didn't look away. Daniel listened, stunned, guilt blooming in his chest. She wasn't wrong. He had left without a backward glance, believing it was the cleanest break. Now he saw the price she had paid for letting him go so easily. Clara, if I had known I would have come back, you should have told me. She shook her head faintly. You were already gone. You had your life. I didn't want to disrupt it. I didn't want to bring you back out of duty. The raw honesty in her voice cut deeper than blame ever could. He swallowed hard, the weight of missed years heavy on his shoulders. It wouldn't have been duty, he said. Not then, and definitely not now. He looked at the girls, then back at her. They're incredible. I don't know how you did it, but they're everything. Clara smiled faintly, a tear slipping down her cheek. They're my everything, she murmured. Daniel took her hand gently, feeling its fragile warmth. They're mine too now, if you'll let them be. For the first time in a long time, Clara looked at him not with anger, not with fear, but with something like fragile hope. But there was something new growing between them, something neither of them could ignore. Clara watched Zoe trace her fingers along the edge of the bed and said softly, They talked about you sometimes, not by name, but when they asked about a dad, I told them maybe one day they'd meet him. Daniel's eyes filled with emotion. They already have, he said, even if I was the last to realize it. Clara turned her head toward him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything that had been left unsaid for too long. Regret, gratitude, and possibility. Daniel knew the road ahead would be complicated. There was so much to explain, so much to rebuild. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the long road, not if it led to them. Clara watched from the bed as he let them guide him, saw how naturally he moved around them now, how instinctively he checked on them, answered their questions, and settled them back into their resting spots. She could see the change in him, not just the man she remembered, but someone transformed by these few intense days. When Daniel finally sat back down beside her bed, she reached for his hand again. Her grip was still weak, but deliberate. I don't know what comes next, she whispered, but I don't want to do it alone. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. You won't. It wasn't a promise. It was a decision, one he had already made days ago, long before she had opened her eyes. Seeing Daniel and the girls by her side, she began to cry. In a soft voice, she admitted she had never told him about the girls, because he had walked away without looking back. She hadn't wanted to force him into something he hadn't chosen. Daniel confessed he would have come back if he had known. The connection between them, though fragile, was still alive. More than that, he could no longer imagine life without those 3 little girls. Daniel had always relied on structure, but there was nothing neat or predictable about the way his life was evolving now. After Clara stabilized, he wasted no time contacting a trusted attorney, not to review contracts or secure investments, but to start guardianship paperwork. The decision hadn't come from pressure or guilt. It came from a place he couldn't ignore anymore, something deeper than duty. The girls saw him as theirs. They followed him with trust in their eyes and comfort in their steps. He didn't need to hear the words "Dad" to know that something had shifted. He wasn't a stand-in or a temporary presence. He was there, and they felt that. As he signed the first stack of forms, he realized he wasn't fighting for them. He was fighting with them, for the right to stay exactly where he already belonged. Clara, recovering slowly in the intensive care wing, had given her quiet consent with just a look. She trusted him now in a way that neither of them could have predicted a week ago. And that trust gave him a sense of purpose, unlike anything he had ever found in boardrooms or pitch decks. The sterile urgency of critical care gave way to something gentler, more familiar. The girls decorated her new room with drawings, some of them shaky, others full of bright suns and smiling stick figures. Zoe hung a picture of all of them standing under a rainbow. Leah carefully taped her name onto Clara's water bottle. Nina arranged the books on the shelf by color, and Daniel brought in Clara's favorite tea, unsure if she'd be able to drink it yet, but certain that she'd notice the gesture. They began sharing meals together at the hospital cafeteria, and although the food was bland, the laughter was not. Zoe would make jokes with too much confidence. Nina would add quiet, clever remarks that surprised everyone, and Leah always made sure everyone had a napkin before starting. Daniel watched them from across the table one evening and realized something humbling. They were already a family. He wasn't auditioning. He wasn't replacing anyone. He was simply arriving late to a life that had space for him after all. With each passing day, Daniel saw pieces of himself slipping away. Not in a bad sense, but in a transformative one. The man who used to take calls during dinner now silenced his phone without a second thought. The man who had assistants for everything now learned to tie tiny shoelaces and braid hair. He didn't read emails before bed. He read stories, usually about dragons or dancing bears. When the girls asked for bedtime tales, they didn't want perfect endings. They wanted stories where people got lost and found each other again, where someone made a mistake and still got a second chance. He saw himself in those stories, and maybe, so did they. Daniel even started learning how to pack balanced lunches. It wasn't natural at first. He Googled too much. But the girls didn't care if their sandwiches weren't cut into perfect shapes. They cared that they were made by him. At night, when they fell asleep with their heads on his shoulder, or their hands loosely holding his, Daniel felt a calm he'd never known. It didn't erase his mistakes. It didn't change how things started, but it was something real, something earned. Her eyes followed Daniel often, not with suspicion, but with something closer to wonder. She saw how the girls looked at him, how they leaned into his presence, and it softened something inside her. One afternoon, as Daniel helped Leah put her hair into a braid, Clara said quietly, "They trust you." He looked up, unsure what to say, but she didn't need a reply. She'd seen it for herself. This wasn't a performance. Daniel had stepped into the mess without hesitation, and more importantly, he had stayed. He wasn't waiting for gratitude or permission. He was building something real without asking for a blueprint. Clara smiled that day, the first true smile since she woke up. It wasn't about forgiveness or the past. It was about the now and the new beginning. They were all quietly agreeing to shape together. Daniel had changed in ways even he hadn't noticed. His assistant called twice during a particularly chaotic lunch, and he ignored both calls, too busy helping Nina clean spilled juice and finding Zoe's missing shoe. Old versions of him would have panicked at the idea of being off-grid, even for an hour. But now, the world outside this makeshift family could wait. His priorities weren't urgent meetings or investment strategies anymore. His schedule was filled with crayon drawings, questions about animals, and Clara's slow but steady steps down the hallway each morning. When she managed to walk unassisted for the first time, the girls clapped like she had climbed a mountain. Daniel's eyes welled up, but he said nothing, just offered his hand, steady and silent. Clara took it not because she needed support, but because they were starting to move in sync again. Every small act, every story, every meal, every quiet night spent with the girls breathing softly in their sleep became a building block, not toward something perfect, but toward something real. Daniel didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need them. What mattered now was presence. The girls laughed together, ate in the hospital cafeteria, drew pictures, and shared stories. Slowly, this improvised family began to take shape. Daniel could feel himself changing. The meticulous executive now knew how to braid hair, pack lunches, and tell bedtime stories, without needing to look anything up. Months had passed since that morning in the hospital, when Clara had first opened her eyes and whispered Daniel's name. Recovery had been slow but steady, marked by quiet milestones and shared victories that stitched them closer together in ways words never could. When Clara was finally discharged, Daniel didn't hesitate. He had already found them a house, a modest, sunlit place in the outskirts of Asheville. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of home his status might have implied, but it was exactly what they needed. Peaceful, warm, and full of space for laughter, messes, and healing. There were no marble countertops or private gates, but there were afternoon board games, walls covered in the girls' drawings, and a kitchen that always smelled like toast or something sweet. Daniel had gone from conference calls to bedtime stories, from business trips to ballet shoe fittings. Somehow, The shift hadn't felt like a loss. It felt like the start of something that made him whole. His work hadn't vanished, but its dominance had softened. Now, Daniel answered emails with Zoe on his lap, negotiated deals with Leah perched on the arm of his chair, and took breaks to help Nina with her spelling homework. Meetings were scheduled around school pickups, and Clara's doctor appointments were non-negotiable slots on his calendar. His colleagues noticed the change. He was still sharp, still driven, but his urgency had evolved. The edges had rounded. He was no longer a man running from one opportunity to the next. He had something, someone worth returning to every single day, and that changed everything. Clara, still rebuilding her strength, began to smile more easily, laugh more freely. She cooked with him, rested beside him, and watched how effortlessly the girls wove Daniel into the rhythm of their days. He was part of the fabric now, not just a guest. He never had to ask for a place at the table. He simply belonged. They painted murals in the hallway and held impromptu concerts in the living room using pots as drums. They argued over silly things and made up minutes later. They asked Daniel questions he didn't always have answers to and didn't mind when he said, "I don't know. Let's find out together." Zoe called him Dad for the first time while handing him a drawing of a stick figure family, and Daniel had to step away for a moment before he could even respond. Nina started hugging him without hesitation. Leah, always the most guarded, began slipping her hand into his when they crossed the street. These moments were small to an outsider, but to Daniel, they were monumental. He no longer measured success by quarterly growth or accolades. He measured it in belly laughs and sleepy whispers of good night, and in the peace he found lying next to Clara, while listening to the rhythmic breathing of 3 small souls sleeping just down the hall. They didn't rush. They weren't rebuilding something old. They were creating something new. One evening, after the girls had fallen asleep in a nest of pillows and storybooks, Clara sat beside Daniel on the porch and said, "I used to think it would have been easier if we'd never crossed paths again. But now I think we just needed the right time." Daniel didn't say much in return. He just reached for her hand. He didn't need to speak for her to know that he felt the same. This life hadn't been planned, but it had become necessary. He no longer wondered what he had missed out on. He was too busy cherishing what he had now. For the first time, Daniel wasn't just present. He was invested in the kind of love that demanded nothing and gave everything. It was a place Clara remembered fondly from her childhood, and the girls had never been. It wasn't far, just a short drive, but it felt like crossing into a new chapter. The girls kicked off their shoes and ran toward the shoreline without waiting for permission. Daniel and Clara followed at a slower pace, watching them skip and laugh and call each other's names with unfiltered joy. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't planned, but it was perfect in the way only real life can be. Clara watched them with a soft smile, then turned to Daniel. Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the breeze. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if they hadn't stopped you that day?" Daniel didn't even need to think. His answer was instant. "Every day," he said, "and every day I'm grateful they did." The girls continued to run along the lake's edge, laughter echoing in the space between trees and water. Daniel watched them, heart full, and knew with quiet certainty that this was no longer a story about a man who found a family. This was about a man who had been saved by one. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe to Rod Stories, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And if someone you know would love this story too, send it to them. They'll thank you for it. See you in the next one.